Right, good morning.
You said not to read it.
No, it's on.
Yes, I'm grand. Good morning and welcome to this Centre for Policy Studies panel on the future of British immigration policy, taking back control. Now, in 2019, the Conservative manifesto promised overall numbers will come down. It also put an emphasis on high-skilled migration. In fact, the last Parliament was probably the most demographically consequential of modern British history. 120,000 people crossed the Channel and entered the country illegally. 40 times that number entered through various legal routes. Once you account for population churn, that was net migration of about 2.5 million people. 2 Birminghams in the space of just 2 years. So the data on a lot of this is very patchy, but when we look at what we know about migrant earnings, employment profiles and so on, it's probably fair to say a majority of these people will not be net contributors to the public purse in the long term, and indeed many might be net recipients from the day they arrive. We're at the point now where immigration policy is almost an existential issue for the Conservative Party, as we saw in the July election. But we're very lucky to be joined today by 3 panellists who have been ahead of the curve on this for years now. So to my left, we have Neil O'Brien, the Conservative MP for Harborough, Oakley and Wigston, former minister and crucially CPS author, Taking Back Control. To his left, we have Nick Timothy, MP for West Suffolk, former Home Office advisor, who was there during the time when Theresa May was actually getting the numbers down, the only time that's been managed in the last few decades. And also, again, a CPS author of Stopping the Crossings on the Miranda policy. And then finally, last but not least, we have Imogen Sinclair, the director of the New Social Covenant Unit, Old Hand in Westminster, previously at the Centre for Social Justice, and she is a visiting fellow at the University of St Mary's. So format today, we're going to start with 3 or 4 minutes of opening remarks from each of the panellists. Then we'll have a discussion up here, and about halfway through, I'll open it up to the floor for questions. So please start formulating your questions now. Right, Neil, could you kick us off, please?
Oh, yeah. So the first thing I should do is thank CPS for all the amazing work that they've done on this. I cannot tell you how valuable Carl's work has been, and more generally, the CPS at the moment under Robert is having an amazing period and is as productive and as important as it was in 1974. So thank you for everything you're doing. On immigration policy, on the legal side, we need a completely different approach. Firstly, we need a very clear philosophy about what we are trying to achieve. And I've talked about us trying to become the grammar school of the Western world. We want to change the mix of immigration to be more selective so that more of the people who come here will be large net contributors. Now, why do we need that philosophy? Now, some people are still in a world of saying more people, more GDP, line goes up, that's a good thing. Or some other slightly more sophisticated people say, well, as long as people can kind of wash their own face, as long as they pay in as much as they take out, then that's fine, you should just have that kind of immigration. And that's wrong because we don't need people to just put in more in terms of tax than they take out in public spending, although a large part of, as Carl says, a large part of the group of people who've come here in recent years haven't been in that position, have been net takers out of the public purse. We actually need them to overachieve on that because although migrants can come here and be wonderful people, kind people, helpful people, they can work hard, potentially on low earnings, there are certain things they can't bring with them. They can't bring with them a new GP surgery. They can't bring with them a mile of motorway. They can't bring with them all those social and physical infrastructure and housing assets that we have built up over a very long period of time. It took us a long time to build our railways, our motorways and so on. And if you just add a lot of people quickly to an economy, you have what's called the dilution of the capital stock. And so overall become less productive. It takes you longer to get to work. When you're at work, you're sharing out the same capital between more people. And housing, above all, becomes very expensive. Now, some people just want to wish that away and say, can't we just build more housing? We should build more housing. We need to build loads more housing. But even if we do massively better, even if we adopt every brilliant CPS idea ever, it is not plausible that we will be able to stabilise affordability at anything like the rates of migration we've had recently. So we need a more selective approach, a smaller amount of high-skilled migration. And in principle, quite a lot of people can sign up to that as a goal. But we also need the institutional architecture to achieve that, because what happens at the moment is there's a crisis. Maybe we don't have enough people in social care. Maybe we don't have enough teachers. Maybe we don't have people at prison officers. And we reach for the easy lever of more migration, more low-skill migration in many cases. So how do we solve that? We need, firstly, a more transparent and proper process. We need an immigration budget. We need clarity about the net contribution of different people who come. The Home Office quite deliberately does not know lots of things, and it does not want to find out, nor does the Treasury. It doesn't want to do the kind of life cycle analysis that is normal in most of the European countries. It doesn't want to figure out who will be a net contributor based on where they come from, what they do, what skill level they have, what age they are, and so on. So we need to start doing that analysis, and we need to have clarity about the effects of policy changes. Not everybody likes the OBR. My old boss, George Osborne, set it up. I think it's a good institution. We have greater clarity about the effects of policy changes. But we don't have that for immigration. We're constantly making little decisions with massive consequences. And insofar as we do analysis, it's often very poor. So Jonathan Portes, one of the people who's driving immigration policy over the last 20 years, predicted that a couple of thousands of people would come from Eastern Europe when we opened up to Eastern Europe. And of course, we know now that it was a very large number of people. And yet we don't learn from our mistakes because we don't have a transparent process. So we need a transparent process, proper modelling of the costs and benefits, and a migration budget every year. And the third thing we need is a cap, a hard cap on the overall amount. Because without that, well, it's like trying to run spending policy if you didn't have the Treasury and you didn't have a budget constraint. If you just said to every department, you can raise whatever you want in tax and you can spend whatever you want, you'd have chaos and the tax burden would become very, very high. And if you said, we're not going to have an inflation target, we don't have an overall target about the amount of inflation, which is sort of like what we did in the 70s, you end up with 25% inflation and chaos. So without that hard constraint, you don't make the trade-offs. You don't say, well, if we're going to have more of this, then we need to have less of that. Until we get into that framework with a hard overall cap, which I would suggest we should aim for the same level that David Cameron was aiming for, of the tens of thousands, then we won't make these trade-offs and we won't have a sensible discussion about migration. Now, some people say, oh, tens of thousands, wait a minute, David Cameron promised that and he didn't deliver it. And of course, at the time, we couldn't deliver it because we had zero control over the amount of people coming from Eastern Europe, and that number was very large. But of course, we do have that control now. It's one of the reasons why people voted the way they did. Not the only reason, but one of the reasons why they voted the way they did in 2016. They wanted to take that control back over that so that we could fix immigration policy. And we took the control back, but then we didn't fix immigration policy, right? And funnily enough, we now have 121 MPs and people are extremely annoyed about us. And all of us who have been elected went through the searing experience of speaking to thousands of people who are extremely angry. Not just about the boats, so that was very salient for them, but also about our overall failure on immigration, our failure to do what we said we would do, time and time again. And I think it is a failure, and we've got to internalise that. We did betray people, right? We promised again and again in every election since 1992, we'd cut the numbers, and then we increased them to a record level. And funnily enough, if you don't do what the electorate want you to do, they don't do what you want them to do. They don't vote for you anymore. That's the deal in a democracy. And so we've got to learn from our mistakes. We've got to show that we are under new management, that we have a clear and clearly different approach to this, that things won't be the same if you put us back in, that we won't just go for the shortcut, the easy answer, we'll just reach for low-skill immigration to solve all these problems, that we will genuinely be a changed party. So that's how I would go about the legal side. Perhaps Nick will talk a bit more about the illegal side.
Brilliant. Thank you, Neil. Nick, over to you.
Well, apparently I'm going to devote my
It's
comments
up
to
to you.
illegal
It's up to you.
immigration.
So I was conscious that I didn't do any of the illegal
I'm
stuff.
kidding. Well, I thought what Neil just said was very telling in lots of ways. And one thing that you said but actually didn't really emphasise too much was how common sense public opinion is so often completely right compared to the so-called expert opinion. The public have said for quite a long time, well, immigration is holding down my wages, or it's causing people in my sector of the economy to get squeezed out of work altogether. And the clever people said, no, that's not really how it works, that's the lump of labour fallacy. But actually, if you look at the serious research done by people like the Migration Advisory Committee, those things are actually often true. People have said for ages, well, immigration is affecting whether I can get a GP appointment. And that was laughed away. And then even cleverer people, the people who are really right, like Neil, started to say, well, this is diluting the capital stock of the country. And then the clever people did then start to say, well, capital stock, that sounds clever. Maybe it's right. But actually, all along, the public have known that this is affecting their access to housing and to healthcare and other public services. So I just wanted to say that to just emphasise one of Neil's points. What I actually wanted to say was I think we can probably agree that the party, now we're in opposition, will reflect on the last 14 years and say this is the biggest broken promise. And we as a party will unite around the proposition that we need much stronger border security and we need legal immigration to be much lower than it has been. The question, though, is not whether we should say those things, it's whether we should use the years of opposition to work out how we achieve those things. Now, in some ways, you can say, well, this is reasonably simple because we have direct levers, especially since the end of free movement. We can, through reductions and caps in the number of visas, just reduce legal immigration. And that is true, and employers will respond to that. The market will change shape, and so on. But I think we have to address some of the things that I think we as a party might find it hard to do in order to get the numbers down. So with legal immigration, that's a few different things. So one example is post-18 education and training. Our entire university model is dependent on student migration. It also distorts what we do in terms of what we pay for and what we encourage young people to do, which then leads to skill shortages, which then drives further demand for other kinds of immigration. So if we want the numbers down, we have to do something with higher education. We have to do something similar with welfare reform, because it is ridiculous that we are still notionally in a system that is designed only to have higher skilled immigration, are importing large numbers of people to do low skilled jobs. Their visas may not say that that's what they're doing, but in effect, that is what they're doing. And the third thing is, especially in the public sector, because the government is every bit as bad as parts of the private sector in this respect, is to think about workforce planning. It is crazy that the Treasury deliberately underfunds the training of doctors and nurses every single year, creating an immigration dependency for the future. Mm-hmm. It costs more money. It's not simple to do because it's expensive, but the long-term costs reach us anyway. So we have to address those things, and I think those are challenges for us, but we'll have to get those right. And the same thing goes for illegal immigration. I will do it for illegal immigration, because it's very easy to say we should, in Keir Starmer's case, smash the gangs, whatever that means. And it's very easy to say we want to stop the crossings, but the question is how, and why hasn't that happened already? Now, this can be about deals with third countries so that we can deport people immediately. We've proved that there are third countries out there that are willing to strike those agreements. We're probably going to see European countries do something similar. But I think the hard things are, one, human rights law, and we can't duck it. That's not about changing the Human Rights Act, that's about the European Convention on Human Rights itself. Two, it's about the regulation of our labour market. It's just way too easy to work illegally in this country. It's way too easy to employ people and treat them badly. And third, connected, you can't look at this problem for any length of time without thinking we need to have a conversation about ID cards. Again, these are difficult conversations for the Conservative Party to have, but if we want to tackle these problems and we want to have a plan to make a difference when we come back into government, those are the things that I think we need to take head on.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nick. Imogen, over to you.
Thanks, Carl. I feel like I'm about to do the dangerous thing and talk about the unclever issue here, which is to do with culture as opposed to the economy. And I personally am kind of encouraged actually by this conference so far, because I think we are finally daring to kind of break out of the binary mould when it comes to what kind of conservative are you? Are you a cultural conservative or are you an economic conservative? As if there is, category 1 and category 2. And I think when it comes to immigration, we started to appreciate more and more the cultural impact of this, particularly when it comes to integration. For years, I feel that we've heard genuine concerns around integration dismissed by not unsound, arguments around needing to import labour as a last resort fix for labour shortages. And that's kind of a greater and a higher need, because it's kind of what the clever people talk about. But now I think we are allowing some of these cultural considerations to breathe a bit in our party, and maybe they're beginning to have kind of some parity of esteem with the economic concerns. And I just think it's plainly obvious, and I think we saw this at the last election, that hundreds of thousands of new arrivals each year has a cultural impact, and I think people have noticed that, not necessarily a negative one, but an impact necessarily. But I think for a nation to be strong, and for a nation to be resilient, and also for a nation to be hospitable to other people that come here legally and legitimately, it's got to have some defining cultural features, a coherent identity, a sense of itself, a self-confidence. See why this kind of feels dangerous, but I think it's important to say. And we're hearing some of this, aren't we, from our leadership candidates actually this week. And I think it's really important for the electorate to be hearing this from our party and from our leaders, because it kind of feels like, to me, we're starting to talk to the public as if they're human beings who have human instincts and worries and hopes, and who are intelligent enough actually to simultaneously hold concerns around the economy and around culture, and to navigate the tension that truly exists here. Jeremy Clarkson, who seems to be on a kind of strange journey at the moment, I'm a huge Clarkson's Farm fan, he expressed some sympathy in The Sun, I think it was, recently, with farmers and plasterers and brickies and butchers, he says, who are concerned about our high levels of immigration, but get dismissed by, he kind of is referring to himself as kind of the London elite, as far-right extremists or racist thugs, whatever it might be. But Clarkson, I thought, put it really well in this piece. He says that actually these people are just human beings with their various interests and habits and whatever, and understandably they hold these things dear and they want to assert them. And he says these people are not just far right, but they're, quote, just people who know that they have to shut up when the last post is played, and that a cheese rolling down a hill is funny. And it's kind of this, like, I thought kind of quite lovely simplicity to, like, how, you know, some of these human instincts might not seem clever or rational, but they're there, and perhaps we call them legitimate or valid or whatever. So for fear of repeating a few things that have already been said, I think there's a piece of work to be done here around getting serious about integration, not as an afterthought, but up front. And it's really hard. It's really, really hard. It won't necessarily come easily, both to kind of host countries and also those that come here. But I think that thinking needs to happen before arrivals, not after.
Thank you, Imogen. I think it's shining a light on a really important dimension of the debate which has been neglected. So I want to start off thinking about a sort of common thread that I think we heard from all three of our panellists, which is the Conservative Party thinking about what it stands for and what principles should a future immigration system be based on. And I think one thing perhaps it has to get straight is what it thinks about the nation state and the relation of the nation state to international institutions, for example. I don't know if, Nick, would you like to kick off as doing future of conservatism sort of?
Yeah, look, I mean, I would answer that in a very simple way, but one that I think is actually quite controversial as soon as you work out what it means. As immigration should only work in the interests of this country and the people who live here. That's what the national interest means. So we sometimes have people arguing that an immigration system, well, maybe it shouldn't even be a system. That actually that the chance of birth in a particular place is unfair, and that people have a right to go wherever they like, or that we have a duty to literally anybody in the world. Of course, you know, we all have a sense of our common humanity, but it is absurd to say that that should be taken to the degree that we should give up on control of migration and any kind of selection, not just in terms of legal immigration, but in the asylum system too. But it also means, when you're talking about the national interest, that we're talking about the country as a whole. We're not talking about sectoral interests, right? We should not be changing the kind of country that we are because it's financially convenient for some universities. But that is, in effect, the argument that lots of people on the other side of the argument tend to make, as though the only hope for provincial towns and cities away from the southeast of England is a university, and that university must be able to bring whoever it wants into the country. And these things then have their ripple effect across the whole of the economy and society. So lots of people on student visas, Neil's done some brilliant work on this, lots of people on student visas are here not because they think that their undergraduate degree, or actually more often their very short master's course, is going to change their lives. It's because they will have the right to work in the economy afterwards, and then having stayed to work for a couple of years, they will be able to move into different visa routes and stay here forever. But even when they're studying, Neil calls it the Deliveroo visa, because, and this comes back to my point about the regulation of the labour market, because in law we allow companies like Deliveroo to say, we're contracting with you one particular rider, and in the contract there's something called a substitution clause which allows that rider to take the licence and just give it to anybody else. And the onus is only on that rider, not on the company, to make sure that that person is paid the minimum wage, is in the country legally, and has the right to work. It's obviously preposterous, and this is an open door for illegal immigration at a massive scale. We should obviously be closing down those loopholes, which is one of the ways in which, one of the things I meant when I said that we need to regulate our labour market better. So I think the immigration system needs to be unambiguously thought of in the context of the national interest and nothing else. And you mentioned international institutions. Our adherence to international law and our membership of international institutions should be judged in the same way. Is it in our national interest to continue to be a member of this kind of organisation? Does it help us more than it limits our freedom to do what is right for our country? I think in the case of the ECHR, I think that fails the test. We should leave the ECHR. But it's national interest.
Yeah, so I started by talking about kind of three principles that should guide our approach. The overall philosophy of the grammar school of Western world, clear transparency, clear process, and then an overall cap, so we have overall discipline. I mean, just to enlarge a little bit on the point about transparency. So we said when we set up the social care visa, for example, we thought 6,000 people would come. How many people came? Who wants to have a guess? Every year, so 6,000 a year, that was the estimate. What am I bid?
It's about 120.
349,000 actually. So you were closer than we were, you know. So close.
Give them a job in their office.
So when there are grotesque failures like that, we need to learn from them, and we need to have a process that is a self-improving system. And you can't get into that. There's a famous book by Samuel Britton called The Treasury Under the Tories, written in the 60s, which was a critique of us in our time there, which led to the creation of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which in a sense, in the long term, led to the creation of the Office for Budget Responsibility. We need the same conversation about the grotesque failure of transparency on immigration policy and the constant failure of the Home Office to answer even the most basic questions about how many people from different nationalities are in this country right now. We don't know. How many people in our prisons were here legally? They won't tell me. You know, every question you ask, they won't tell you. Right. So the transparency thing, I just want to emphasize that a little bit more. But one other principle, and this is drawing on the point about culture as well, that I do think is salient, is if you have just done what we've done and had unbelievably high level of immigration, you know, 1 in 60 people in the country has arrived within the last year, there's one important thing you must not do in that situation, which is to create a wider culture which systematically belittles, critiques, undermines, and does down the existing culture of that country. What you don't want to combine is a very rapid move to a radically more multi-ethnic, more multicultural society with the attempts to kind of break and do down the leading culture of the country that they're all arriving into, because then there's nothing for people to anchor into. whatever level of migration you've got, and obviously I argue that it should be much lower, you really want them to have a strong lead culture to be able to integrate into, to be proud of that. And yet, every single cultural institution in Britain seems bent on doing down every aspect of our history. Winston Churchill was a racist. Some random social worker was the same. You know, every single one seems bent on saying that everything about history is bad. That's a really bad idea. It's just, if you're going to have a high level of immigration, even if you're going to have a low level of immigration, you want to really go at some on integration, and slightly more positively, rather than just the work bashing. We absolutely must do more on the English language thing, because that is the no-brainer, the first step in everything to do with integration. We're super squeamish about talking about some of the problems this causes, particularly in the NHS, right? And we actually have a counter-productive approach in some of these things. So the BMA have this thing about we must reduce the number of complaints against clinicians from other countries. No. The challenge is not to mute the number of legitimate complaints. The challenge is to reduce the size of the problem in the first place. And I meet constituents all the time. I had a lovely old lady, election, have you got any problems? No, I haven't got any problems. 10 minutes later into competition, she has a lot of problems. And one of her problems is she's scared of going to hospital. She's genuinely scared because the last time she was in, she couldn't make herself understood and she couldn't understand the people in there. And she lives in Leicester, right? And she's pretty good at accents, but she couldn't understand. Likewise, a friend of ours. Her son had a near-death experience. The clinician is doing the handover at the end of their time in hospital. And he's a nice guy. She was a wonderful nurse. And I had to say, I am so sorry, I just cannot understand what you're saying. And she was lovely about it, and she went away and got someone else. But operating in a clinical environment, making life and death decisions where people in the team and patients can't understand any of that is a bloody dangerous thing to do. And in health, we've got to be much more demanding about standards of English, not basic English, but good English. You've got to be able to really understand the nuances of stuff. And we've got to make that part of our migration policy more generally, both in terms of who we select in the first place and particularly in the journey from arriving to citizenship, which in the UK is really quite a short journey compared to some other countries. One of my friends is in Switzerland at the moment. The journey to getting Swiss citizenship, I can promise you, is not an easy one. But in the UK, 5 years here, you'll get indefinite leave to remain. A lot longer after that, you'll get citizenship. And the UK, compared to other countries, is very lax in terms of things like, you can have committed quite serious criminal offences and still continue on the journey in the way that I'm afraid in Switzerland that your journey towards citizenship will be halted if you exploit their hospitality. So this point about the increasing importance of a lead culture, national confidence, I do think is an important one. And the combination of high level of immigration with a low level of integration and low self-confidence, which is not attractive in a country any more than it's attractive in an individual, is a really toxic one. So it's all the more important that we can create that kind of what the Germans call a kind of Leitkultur, a lead culture that everyone could buy into and what we're proud of.
So some people might say, all very well, but at the end of the day, we have to have high levels of migration. We have an ageing population. The state's going to be dependent on it. We don't have enough workers. What do the panellists say to that? Imogen?
Is this our demographic question?
Yes, indeed.
Just firstly, on the previous question, I think obviously it's very important that we don't conflate legal and illegal migration, but there are, I think, some overlapping underlying principles about agency. And just to kind of pick up on Nick's point about national interest, I think sometimes we fail to ask the question, what do we want? What do we want our university sector to look like? What do we want our NHS to look like? What do we want our social care system to look like? And, I've heard arguments made about, importing students means that we can keep this university, props up this university. Is it a good university? Does it produce, does it put on reputable degrees? Does it produce students that go on to earn high salaries? The clever questions. What do we want? I think we sometimes fail to ask that question kind of ourselves. What do we want these various sectors to look like? And then ask the question about how our immigration policy fits in to that question. Similarly, when it comes to small boats, these are our borders. This is our problem. On the demographic question, I think before you kind of even get into immigration, just to kind of look at a more basic context here, which is that our population is getting older, people are living for longer, and often our extended families are no longer living close together. So that kind of informal care and support that you may have may ordinarily have used to get from your children isn't there anymore. I'm from Cheshire. I live in London. That's going to be interesting when my husband and I start a family. So already we're kind of living in that new context, as it were, and so importing workers to our social care system rather than using the traditional method of procreating, I think is something that kind of we don't like to talk about. It's slightly awkward because talk about sex, but we have to. And I think that there does seem to be a kind of greater confidence in talking about kind of pro-natalist policies, and I think that's really important. You know, you often read in the newspaper kind of talking about breed for Britain, and I don't think it's particularly helpful, but it does seem to be like a reasonable conversation to have in a pub with your friends over drinks. But I understand why politicians kind of don't want to talk about it, but I do think fundamentally we need to start kind of growing our own workforce, as it were. And the evidence suggests that women do want more children than they feel they're able to have. And I don't know how. I don't know what the government's, certainly this government's plan is to kind of help them breed for Britain. I said I wouldn't repeat that. And of course, the immigrants that come here on their social care visas, they grow old too, and they need support in their old age too. So when it comes to kind of supporting people to start families of their own, I don't think we should be as squeamish as we are about it. And I kind of feel self-conscious saying this myself, but the incentives have to sit somewhere. And I think for government to say, okay, we're going to decide that incentives in our tax and benefit system are going to sit in a place which encourage people to start a family if they want to, is not a bad thing. And I don't think it should be controversial.
Yeah, in a sense, this is a great question, and it's a proper challenge to people who do want to reduce the overall amount of immigration. But the key thing is, of course, yes, migrants themselves get old. So migration will only help you if you're doing all the things that we suggest anyway, right? If you bring in people who are going to be not net contributors but net recipients, then you're making your ageing society problem even worse. And that is a large share of the migration mix that we've had over recent years. There's the thing about framing, which we've still not succeeded in changing in this debate. People on the pro-migration side of the equation, if I can call it that, we're all pro-migration under the right terms, but people on that side want to constantly frame the argument as, is the average migrant a net contributor or not? And if the average person is, then migration's good, thumbs up to whatever migration policies we want to push through. This is a dumb framing, right? What you want to do is be more selective. There are people who come to this country and are massive contributors. We're lucky to have them. They're amazing people. They're not just nice people and good people and nice members of our society, but they're incredible contributors to us. But there are also people in the opposite direction who have a big net cost to us, right? And they might be lovely people, they might be good people, but they're huge cost to the taxpayer. And our job as policy is not to just think about the median, it's to think, how do we shift the balance, right? How do we have fewer of the people who are going to be net recipients and more of the people who are going to be big net contributors, right? That's the framing of policy, and we've still not quite got the public discussion about this right. So it's clear from all the work, if you read the OBR's fiscal risk report every year, they produce what I call the graph of doom that shows the ageing society causing the public finances to go into a meltdown over the next couple of decades. I was very conscious of this as a health minister. You could see the effect of an ageing society on demand in the NHS. A stat I always remember from when I was in charge of GPs was there were a third more people over the age of 70 than there were in 2010, and they take 5 times more GP appointments every year than a young working person, right? And so we did succeed in delivering 50 million extra GP appointments every year over the course of last Parliament. We met our manifesto commitment. Every surgery is doing 44 more appointments every working day, and people didn't feel it because the demand is going up and up and up. So the ageing society, massive challenge, but migration will only help you with that if you're doing all the right things on immigration. It could make things even worse if you're not. And just to touch on this point about, for want of a word you call pronatalism, again, I think it's so interesting the framing in this country is so different to the rest of Europe. So at the start of the year, Emmanuel Macron gave a great speech where he said, we want a demographic rearmament in France. France will be stronger if we raise the birth rate. I'm going to introduce new parental leave to back this up. And then when Keir Starmer was asked about this the other day, he said, I'm not going to tell people how many kids to have, which is, I'm not having a go at him because that's a totally normal reaction of every British politician. The French have been on the perinatalism thing for 100 years, and that's one of the reasons why they have much higher birth rate and healthier demographics than the rest. But Starmer's framing is all wrong. The framing of this thing about being a parent is not we are trying to make people do something that they don't want to do, right? There's loads of people who either want to have kids or want to have more kids, and they can't because of a bunch of practical factors that we need to be addressing. We need to help them achieve their own goals, not force them to do something they don't want to do. So I do think that there is a conversation that is starting and getting stronger and stronger all over the world about the demographic challenge, which is shared not just by developed industrialized countries, but increasingly by poor countries, right? So countries like Vietnam are going to get old before they get rich. And this conversation is happening everywhere, and we need to be part of it. But it's very clear that unless you address that underlying thing about the aging society and the birth gap between how many people want and how many they have, nothing you do plausibly on immigration will fill that hole. And the OBR do some different scenarios for this, and you don't win in either of them. And unless, for this is for like more migration, less migration, it's not enough unless you also address the underlying cause. If you just try and address the problems of an aging society with more migration, you're setting yourself on an endless treadmill because the migrants just get old. If you have something that is going asymptotically downwards, if you have a population that is declining because you're not at replacement fertility, then you need asymptotically, exponentially increasing levels of migration to fill the hole. It's just implausible. For some countries, it's impossible, like China. There's not enough migrants in the world for them to fix the problem that way. And it's not plausible for us either. So you've got to address the underlying problem. Pop quiz again. If you are South Korean, if there's 100 of you, how many grandchildren will you have at current fertility rates? There's 100 of you now.
26.
15.
Wow.
And so the North Koreans are going to win. Bad news. The Koreans have done everything right. The North Koreans are going to win because they've screwed up so badly on such an important thing. If we were at the levels of fertility we were at in 2010, we would be having 90 odd, and now we're going to be having something more like 60 odd, right? And so in the space of a few short years, we've gone right for the ball. Anyway, we've gone into a different subject, but the two things are related. It's not inconsistent to be pro helping people to achieve their own goals of having kids and pro having a more selective migration policy. In fact, the two intimately linked. Both of them are the things we need to do to solve the challenges of an ageing society.
Right, thank you, Neil. I'm conscious of the time, so I think we're going to open it to questions from the floor now. Questions everywhere. Start down here, please.
Hello, very interesting panel. Jonathan Thomas of the Social Market Foundation. At the last election, the Reform Party proposed an employer immigration tax, a higher rate of national insurance to be paid by employers hiring workers from overseas. I'll be interested in the panel's view on that.
Anyone want to jump in?
We've got two taxes already which we've increased. We've got the immigration skills surcharge and the health surcharge. So we have already done quite a lot of that. I think it's more important to just choose who you want to get in the first place rather than change things through taxation. Government has directly got controls over the levers about who comes. I'm not sure why you need a tax lever in order to... I don't think it's a mad idea. We've got some of this already, but you can directly change the mix yourself. I'm not sure you need to use taxes to sort of clear up afterwards.
I mean, I personally don't have a problem in principle with it. We're at the beginning of a conversation about how we assess the challenge before us, the problems and the shortcomings of the past. So I wouldn't say this is categorically something that needs to be in a manifesto. But it is one thing that you can consider. But as Neil said, you've basically got your levers with visas. You've got to reform the economy. You've got to reform welfare, higher education, and so on. Then, yeah, I mean, I think if you then want to consider the fact that that migrants haven't yet, by definition they're just arriving, haven't yet paid into a system, then you might want to consider whether that should go further. I'm open-minded.
Right, the gentleman at the back, please.
Thank you. Damien Chunnelel, Kensington and Bayswater. quick statement. The UK needs immigration because we're at full employment and the demographic factors you've talked about. Raising the birth rate will take far too long. This is an issue today. But why does no one talk about the composition of immigration? Pre-2016, immigration on an aggregate per capita basis, I think Nick, you've talked about this, was accretive to the public purse. People were young people coming in from Europe, they paid their taxes, they didn't claim public benefits, didn't come with dependents, and arguably culturally more similar to many places in the UK. Post-2016, that's collapsed, and we've replaced it with people coming in who, on an aggregate per capita basis, are less accretive to the public purse, bring in lots of dependents, claiming public welfare benefits. This is the issue, and nobody talks about this. I'd like the panel's comments on that.
We talk about it.
I mean, I think you're right, sir. I think the mix has not got better in the way that was promised under the new system. It may well have got worse and less favourable. It's not true that we're at full employment, though. I mean, like 1 in 10 working age adults is not in work. They're on out-of-work benefits. They're not unemployed anymore. They're on sickness benefits, and that's a massive policy challenge. So I just don't believe that it's overstated that there's no more labour you can get in the UK. But the challenge is to change the skill mix, exactly you say, and that in lots of ways we've gone backwards. I mean, if you look at the average earnings of the two main growth groups, people from India and people from Nigeria, they were safely above the UK average. They're now below, right? We've changed the mix in a way that is likely to be less favourable economically, apart from anything else.
I think I think your question, sir, touches on this issue of the kind of pull factors. And I think it is the CPS that, maybe it was even this report, talked about how generous, when it comes to social housing, how generous we are to migrants. I think there was a stat I wrote down. As it stands, people who've been convicted of various terrorism offences can qualify for social housing. And I just think sort of re-establishing kind of that link between social housing need, employment history perhaps, and links to the local area is something that we know from polling and surveys, etc., is very, very popular. And I think that's something that we need to consider seriously.
Lady in the red jumper here.
Hi. Given the ghettoisation of certain areas of our towns and cities and the failure of certain communities to integrate and the problems they cause, would you consider banning or limiting migration and travel from and to certain countries like Pakistan? And also, how would you go about deporting I think it's 40,000 people on our terrorist watch list?
Deportations and cultural compatibility.
Nick should answer that first.
Well, I mean, the vast majority of the people on those watch lists will be UK nationals, so they can't be deported. The issues that we have with deportation, where people are foreign nationals, relate to the various barriers that we've already touched on, with rights-based appeals and so on. And frankly, we need to completely change the balance with human rights laws so that people like that are removed from the country. I went into the Home Office in 2010 with a full head of hair. Came out in 2015. One of the most stressful things that we did in that time, and it felt like I was commuting to Amman for a period, was the deportation of Abu Qatada. We basically only got him out of the country in the end after the ECHR, just after the court kept moving the goalposts. Once the Jordanians basically agreed that they weren't going to prosecute him. That is insane. He was clearly, don't know if I'm allowed to say he was clearly guilty. So I don't know what that means in Jordanian law, but I didn't say it in English law. That's obviously crazy. In terms of the integration of different diaspora groups, I think one of the conversations we're going to need to have when we're thinking about how we approach immigration policies for a future Conservative government, and Kemi's touched on this a little bit this week, is that we shouldn't only think about this in economic terms, because migration does change the composition of the country. And we are struggling in lots of our cities and towns with a lack of integration. And the country needs space to breathe and the space for us to try to get this right in places where it hasn't been going right. You don't make that easier by adding more and more with really, really high rates of immigration. I don't know what the precise mechanisms are, but I think it is possible to imagine metrics that would allow you to assess the likelihood of integration or otherwise. And I think that is something that we need to have a conversation about.
Gentleman over there, Tom.
Thanks very much. You mentioned the NHS's reliance on foreign staff and the problems that raises. Obviously, foreign-trained doctors are 2.5 times more likely to be reported for medical negligence to the GMC than British-trained doctors. And we're also seeing in teaching an increasing reliance on foreign staff, where we now have a system that will give recruits from any country in the world, regardless of educational levels, a £10,000 joining bonus, whereas domestic recruits get nothing. So I was just wondering what kind of incentives could you come up with to create better workforce planning to fulfil gaps in the public sector from existing British workers?
So I'm generally not very sympathetic to people who bash my former employer at the Treasury. Most of them are just people who are angry that 1 and 1 adds up to 2 rather than a larger amount. But I'm afraid in migration policy, the Treasury is guilty of extreme short-termism. And in terms of medical staff, it is mad that we went in the NHS between 1948 and 2023 without it ever having an enunciated plan for the future of its own workforce. And the Treasury has been part of that, of not wanting to put in the relatively small amount of extra financing for very high-value university subjects in medicine to save a tiny amount of money in the short term and then create a massive problem and an extra cost in the long term. Mad that we have highly able, completely qualified young people. We're turning them away from medical school, from dental school and so on, and then importing people from the world's poorest countries. I was out in Nepal. My wife was doing a medical camp a few years back, and like people are desperate. They're desperate for medics. It's on the red list. We're not supposed to recruit from there, and yet we do, right? Tell me about how wonderfully moral we are for doing this. So we have the workforce plan now. It's essential that is delivered. We need the same thing in other sectors. There are, make life difficult for ourselves. There are sectors where it's less about skills and forward planning and stuff like that, and it is about pay. Social care is an example of one of that. It's sort of one of the main reasons we have a lot of low-skill immigration to the UK. It's widely abused. There's a huge amount of modern slavery. People are getting ripped off. A lot of people ripping others off as well and doing visa mills for the social care visa. And whenever you create a great big hole in your high-skill immigration system, lots of people will try and flow through it. But there's a challenge there, right? And when I was a social care minister, people were moving jobs in social care for pennies different. And if you had a place where an Amazon warehouse opened, you would find you had a recruitment problem in social care because it's very competitive with other sources of low wage labour. And the people say, look, you'll have to find some extra money if you want to have a higher quality of social care and higher wages in the social care sector. And I say, yes, and we should do that, right? None of us want our relatives to be poorly cared for in their final and most vulnerable days. And it's really important, I think, for the Conservative Party as we change, become a party that people want to vote for again, not to be a Grindian party about grinding down these things that matter so much to people to the lowest possible cost. We want to have high quality. It's not all true that everyone in social care is from overseas. 80% of them are British, overwhelmingly female, doing a wonderful job for people in a great deal of needs, often very physical, you're wiping someone's bum, whatever. And yeah, I think we should try and pay them a little bit more rather than just rely on importing people from all over the world with all kinds of consequences. And I do just want to say, all of these things, they're not a criticism of the people that come here. They're good people. They want to do, in that case, many want to work. It's just that we've got to think about what our interest is and what's the right thing for this country and the people who work in these low-pay sectors. And people are constantly flipping between saying, oh, there's no impact on wages from low-skill immigration, and then saying it's essential we have tons of low-skill immigration, otherwise social care will collapse. The hypocrisy there. So there are some bits of this that are more challenging, and some of it's are no-brainers, like the health plan for the NHS. Some of it's a bit more challenging as we have to find the resources if you want to have a decent service.
We just need to make them really attractive as well. So my mum's a teacher, my brother's a nurse, they're both miserable. And they wouldn't
Yes.
they wouldn't
Yes, it's all about money.
recommend anyone goes into teaching or nursing. And that's a problem. I think it does come down to pay. It's not just clapping for carers once in a while.
And there's loads of false economies. Now, we're now paying these huge wodgers on top of the normal teaching salary to recruit for people from overseas. And I'm not convinced that by the time you've added on those extra bungs to get people to come here, we're saving any money. And you're dropping people who are new to the country into highly multi-ethnic, multicultural classrooms in London, which is like, it's going to be it's going to create a very complicated situation. But you're right, it's not all about money. I mean, teaching, the main reason people leave is bad behaviour. And we, I think, do have a proud record on that. Michael Gove's stuff did work. Phillipson is going to unwind that and debase everything and make behaviour worse. So yes. I think we will be able to do some quite powerful campaigning around all that.
Right. The lady there.
Hello, my name's Georgiana from the Jobs Foundation. Taking back control and creating a new independent government body, I don't think that was part of certainly the original strap for that, but do you really think that a new government body can do, which I completely agree with you, Neil, on shine a light on, ensuring that we have a much more sort of selective approach to immigration? Do you think it's possible to have something as part of government or potentially independent that really can not just enshrine the kind of immigration argument that we have at the moment, which is kind of your pro or your anti, and not just kind of have more of the same, and then really in turn for you guys, the politicians, it's just actually kind of a stick on your back to, to another sort of body to potentially try and argue with rather than to support what I would say is a very sensible plan.
Yeah. So I'm not wedded to the idea of a new body as the metaphor about the OBR or whatever. I'm happy for the Home Office to do this or the Treasury to do it, but I want them to do the work, right? I want them to start thinking about the costs and benefits, even just to the taxpayer, of different types of migration. They won't do it. Other countries already do it. I want us to be able to answer basic questions like, how many people from different countries are in this country right now? We can't answer. That's a joke. It's farcical. I want the Home Office to be able, when I ask a parliamentary question like, of those people who claimed asylum and then disappeared, how many of them have left the country? I want them to be able to answer the question, not say we don't know the answer, right? I want them to do their job. And I don't care if it's in a new body, there's arguments for setting something up like that, but I want the work to be done, and it's a joke. The whole framework of migration policy is an absolute joke at the moment because we don't even know the basics about what is going on, what the costs and benefits are, and of course you can't make sensible decisions in that context. It's a joke.
Why aren't they collecting the data?
Two reasons. The Treasury and the Home Office. The Treasury do not want to have a conversation about the costs and benefits of migration, and they don't want to do sophisticated life cycle analysis for all this stuff because they want to just be able to pull on the lever that saves you some money in the short term. Okay. The Home Office don't want to know things because then they'll have to answer my questions, and some of the answers are awkward, so it's better to not know, like the ultimate spy, like there's movies about idiot spies. If you don't know the answer, then you won't have to tell anyone. And so there's a deliberate policy of not finding out information, not joining up data sets. And so in answers to parliamentary questions, they say things like, we hold the data, but it would be excessively costly to join up this data to match immigration data to crime data or whatever it is, to health data. So they don't do it.
Nick, does that sound like the Home Office you remember?
Yes.
Right. Gentleman here, just behind you, Jack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Abdul Mateen from the Isle of Wight Conservative Association. The Third World has prospered in the last 25 years. Hundreds of millions of people have come out of poverty. And I'm very shocked that 300 million people are on the move. And we see UK can't pay £300 to pensioners, winter fuel allowance. How on earth are we going to allow more immigrants, because charity does begin at home. Thank you.
This point about the development of the Third World is actually really important, because one of the arguments that's often deployed by people I disagree with is that actually if you want to do something about tackling the flow, then you need to spend lots more on aid in order to better develop other countries so people won't want to leave them. Actually, all the evidence shows that the better developed countries get, the more people want to leave them, because until they reach the standard we're at, there will always be an incentive to move, and the more information they have, the better educated they are, and so on, the more they will want to migrate. So there may be arguments for spending on international development, but they ain't connected to immigration. And on the point about who we spend our money on, because I think we've talked about this, but I think the clarity of the statistic I'm about to say will sum this up. When we're talking about illegal migrants crossing the Channel, as Neil says, the British state is doing its best to cover its eyes and ears and not calculate the fiscal consequences of that profile of migration. We're actually doing less research and publishing less data than we were 10 years ago. European countries are starting to do the opposite. And the Danish government publishes regular fiscal analyses of different profiles of migrant, which show staggeringly different outcomes in terms of the extent of the contribution or the extent of the receipt of public money. There was a study connected to the University of Amsterdam, which said that for illegal immigrants to the Netherlands, of the profiles that they had, the lifetime cost converted into sterling net is £400,000 per person. There is no reason to think that the numbers for the migrants coming here would be very different. So we're probably talking, for every single channel crosser, £400,000 per person.
So just on your point, I think this is so important, because sometimes people say the solution on illegal immigration is just more legal immigration. And I always, when I think about it, so I always think, so about, since 2018, about 2,300 people have come on the small boats from India, right? And India is booming economy, future superpower, amazing space program, world's largest democracy. Very easy to come to the UK from India. We've given out over that period 1.3 million non-visitor visas, 1.3 million, and yet 2,300 people have got in boats, risked their lives to come across illegally. There is infinite demand, more or less, to come to the UK. And so as long as you have any kind of controls, any kind of system to have the kind of selective high-skill migration that we've been talking about, people are going to want to come illegally. It's utter myth and wrong-headed to think that you can solve this problem just by having more legal migration. I think the Indian case just shows you, even the best possible backdrop, booming economy, easy to come to the UK, people still come illegally.
I appreciate the charity begins at home sentiment, but I do think, this is my opportunity to sound like a virtuous person, that the last Conservative government, I do think, hesitant to use the word failed, but I think that when it comes to the safe and legal route question, I think there was a lack of thinking about that, and there did seem to be some kind of awkward select committee hearings where, you know, simple questions were asked about safe and legal routes for those genuinely fleeing war, persecution, famine, whatever. And I think you do need both. I think you do need a proper safe and legal route mechanism to bring people to this country. But again, I suppose it is about what do we want on our terms. And I think that's the kind of key underlying principle.
But can I follow up on that? Because actually, in the last 5 years or so, we've had more people come to this country through safe and legal routes than we've ever had in our history.
Right.
I remember the select committee hearings you're talking about, and the answers were excruciating. But the correct answer is that we have created unprecedented safe and legal routes for Hong Kongers, for Ukrainians, and for Syrians and Afghans. The point is that there isn't a general safe and legal route for anybody in the world, but the solution to problems anywhere in the world can't be that any individual in a place which is, sadly not very well off or benighted by a particular problem must be able to apply to come to this country. It's literally impossible. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people probably. So you can't do this, and you can't You can do what the government has done and create some targeted safe and legal routes. But but as Neil said, if the answer to illegal immigration is to say, well, we'll have safe and legal routes and then people won't cross the channel in dangerous circumstances, that can only work if those safe and legal routes are literally open to anybody.
Selective
And that's
safe and legal
nonsense.
routes on our terms. Yeah.
Right, I'm very sorry, but we are at time now. Please join me there in thanking our panellists.